A soldier came home, but not to peace. Former Navy SEAL Ethan Cole returned to the ruined coastal property, hoping to sell the land and bury the guilt of a 25-year-old tragedy. He wanted silence, but the moment his old service dog, Echo, dragged him into a hidden cove, Ethan froze. He found a giant bald eagle, trapped and dying, a victim of the very same greed that killed his father decades ago. He knew he couldn't leave it. What happened next will make you believe that loyalty and purpose can bring a miracle even to the most broken places. You won't believe how this story ends. Before we start, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The air hung heavy and perpetually damp over the Olympic Peninsula, Washington. It was a late November afternoon, the sky the color of wet slate meeting the gray-green expanse of the Pacific in a bruised horizon. The wind, carrying the sharp, clean scent of salt and ancient cedar, whistled through the tangled undergrowth lining the winding coastal road. This was a land of raw, untamed beauty, where the forest met the ocean in a dramatic, often violent collision. The vehicle cutting through the gloom was a battered 1998 Ford F-250, painted a faded moss green. Its suspension groaned with every pothole, a metallic protest against the decades of service and the weight of the life it carried. Behind the wheel was Ethan Cole, a man carved from the kind of granite that had seen too much weather. At 55, he possessed the lean, coiled physique of someone who never truly retired from physical readiness. His face, deeply lined around the eyes and mouth, was perpetually shaded by the brim of a worn, dark baseball cap. His hair, what little remained, was silver, matching the steely gray of his eyes that held the distant, guarded look common among men who had spent their careers navigating chaos and violence. He wore a heavy, unremarkable Navy work jacket over a faded cotton T-shirt. Ethan was a former Navy SEAL, a man whose identity had been forged in the high-stakes environment of black operations, only to be dismantled by the quiet, unrelenting guilt he carried for the last 25 years. Beside him, occupying the passenger seat with the solemn dignity of an elder statesman, lay Echo. Echo was a magnificent German shepherd, a former search and rescue (SAR) dog who had served alongside Ethan for 10 years. His coat was a striking blend of sable and deep black, though the muzzle and a broad swath across his chest were now dusted with the soft white of his 13 years. He was massive, built for endurance, but the recent months had introduced a noticeable stiffness to his gait. His amber eyes, intelligent and weary, were half closed, but his large, erect ears twitched constantly, mapping the terrain and his master's quiet anxiety. Echo wasn't just a dog. He was Ethan's only confidant, his anchor, the silent partner who had shared his life's most brutal and most mundane moments. Ethan eased the truck onto a gravel track so overgrown it was barely discernible from the surrounding brush. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was overwhelming, broken only by the rhythmic crash of the distant surf. He was home, or rather, at the place that owned his soul. This was the Mercer homestead, or what remained of it, a sprawling 20-acre coastal bluff dominated by a skeletal, century-old cedar cabin and the hulking stone base of a decommissioned lighthouse. It had been his father's sanctuary. Ethan's father, Jeremiah Cole, had been a beloved local fire captain and a passionate amateur deep-sea diver. Jeremiah had perished in a suspicious explosion at the old fishing pier a quarter-century ago. Ethan, then a young, driven Navy enlistee who had chosen duty over family, had missed his father's final years and the disaster that claimed him. The guilt, the conviction that he had abandoned his post, had been a quiet poison ever since. He was here now to sever the last tie. He would sign the papers, take the meager proceeds, and disappear into the dry, unremarkable inland, finally free of the cold Pacific air and the ghosts it carried. "End of the line, buddy," Ethan murmured, reaching over to scratch Echo's thick neck. Echo responded with a low, rumbling exhale, pressing his heavy head against Ethan's thigh in silent acknowledgement. Ethan opened the driver's side door. The cold air hit him, instantly raising the small hairs on his arms. He grabbed a nylon duffel bag and a heavy canvas tool roll from the back seat. The cabin was a wreck. Black moss covered the decaying porch, and a shattered window on the ground floor testified to decades of neglect and weather. He stepped onto the porch, the old wood groaning a mournful protest. As Ethan was fumbling with the rusted padlock on the front door, the silence was aggressively interrupted. The sound of a powerful, perfectly tuned engine roared up the gravel drive. A gleaming, metallic black Lexus LX 600 SUV, freshly detailed, tires thick and clean, pulled up 20 feet away, stopping with an authoritative halt. It was the antithesis of Ethan's life and his truck. The driver's door opened, and a man unfolded himself from the luxurious leather interior. This was Walter Vance. Vance was 52, but meticulously preserved. He was tall, running slightly to seed, with a polished, heavy look. He wore a tailor-made shearling coat the color of honey over expensive Italian loafers that looked utterly out of place on the muddy ground. His hair was thick, perfectly styled and silvering at the temples, lending him an air of aggressive authority rather than wisdom. Vance was a prominent, ruthless real estate developer known locally as the Coast Eater, for his practice of buying up historical coastal land and converting it into exclusive, sterile luxury resorts. He was driven purely by profit, viewing land, history, and people as inconvenient assets to be leveraged and dismissed. Vance surveyed the scene: Ethan's dilapidated truck, the crumbling cabin, the weary old man, with a slow, predatory smile. "Cole. Ethan Cole, I presume." Vance's voice was loud, booming with false bonhomie and condescension. He didn't wait for an answer. "Heard your old heap was limping into town. Should have known you'd look, well, about the same as this shack. Broken down." Echo, sensing the intrusion and the threat in the man's tone, lifted his head. A low, gravelly growl vibrated deep in his chest. Ethan ignored Vance's insult, his voice flat and dangerous in its quietness. "You're trespassing, Vance. Technically, I'm showing interest in a distressed asset, Cole, and don't bother with the hero act. I own everything around you, from the creek to the lighthouse." Vance gestured dismissively toward the stone tower looming on the bluff's edge, its powerful lens dark and dormant. "It's a magnificent piece of real estate you've inherited, an eyesore currently, but magnificent potential." Vance paused, stepping closer, holding his expensive coat away from the mud. "Listen, I'll cut the chase. I need this parcel. It completes the Cove Retreat development. I'll give you a generous offer right now. Enough cash to fill your tank, buy a new back brace, and get you a one-way ticket to Florida. You've been gone 25 years. You left the land to rot, just like you left your father to—" He paused, letting the implication hang in the chilly air. "You're too old to play rancher. Sell it. You don't serve a purpose here anymore." The last sentence, delivered with calculated precision, struck a nerve. The Navy SEAL training kicked in, the immediate cold control required when under fire. Ethan's gaze narrowed, the gray eyes hardening to slate. "It's not for sale, Vance," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried more weight than Vance's shout. Vance laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Don't be a fool, Cole. You're broke, you're tired, and you're living in a ghost town. When you freeze your ass off tonight trying to start that 20-year-old generator, don't come crawling to my gate. I'll buy the deed from the county when they foreclose." Ethan stepped away from the door and walked toward Vance, slowly and deliberately, forcing Vance to take an instinctive step back. Ethan was shorter, but the power radiating from him was palpable. "Get off my property, Harlan," Ethan said, using the man's first name as a clear dismissal. "Or I will make you understand exactly how much purpose I still serve." Vance's confidence flickered. He saw the genuine, focused threat in Ethan's eyes, the look of a man who had made life-or-death decisions in seconds. He sneered, turning toward his pristine SUV. "Fine. Enjoy your ghosts, Cole, but you won't last the winter." Vance climbed back into his vehicle, slamming the heavy door. The Lexus spun slightly on the gravel, showering the cedar cabin with a spray of small stones, and then roared back down the overgrown drive, disappearing as quickly as it had arrived. Ethan stood in the cold, watching the taillights fade. His fists were clenched, the gloves creaking. He had come here to retreat, to surrender the land, but Vance's predatory arrogance had triggered a response that went deeper than logic. He had come home to sell, but he had just decided to stay. He turned back to the derelict cabin. "Looks like we have work to do, Echo," Ethan murmured. The German shepherd, having stood silently at the truck, stepped down onto the damp earth, his tail giving a single firm thump against the gravel. The mission had changed. Ethan Cole spent the first night back on the Olympic Peninsula ranch much like he had spent the last 25 years, restless and cold. The old cedar cabin was a sieve against the damp November air. He'd managed to clear a small space in the living room, spreading out his worn sleeping bag on the dusty, splintered floor, but the silence, once the wind died down, was heavy with the presence of his father's absence. Every creak of the aging timbers was a whisper of the past. Beside him, Echo, the 13-year-old German shepherd, lay curled in a tight ball, his breathing slow and shallow, conserving the warmth his old body struggled to generate. As the weak gray morning light filtered through the broken window panes, Ethan rose, his 55-year-old body protesting the cold and the hard floor. He went through the familiar, disciplined motions of a man who'd trained for decades to function under duress. A quick, freezing wash with bottled water and brewing a mug of black coffee on his small propane stove. He needed to get moving, to put distance between himself and the oppressive cabin. "Time for patrol, Echo," he murmured. The German shepherd uncurled with a slow groan, rising to his full sable and black height, shaking off the stiffness with a determined effort. They made their way down the treacherous, moss-covered path that led from the bluff to the rocky coastline. The terrain here was challenging, unforgiving. Ethan walked with the focused, measured pace of a man who trusts his footing implicitly. He was searching for anything that could be salvaged: boards, canvas, tools, anything to honor the sudden, reckless commitment he'd made to Walter Vance yesterday. They had been walking along the tide line for perhaps half an hour, the crash of the surf dulling the senses, when Echo's demeanor abruptly changed. The dog had been trotting a few yards ahead, nose down, occasionally investigating a piece of driftwood. Now, his ears snapped forward, his tail went rigid, and he stopped dead, letting out a sharp, high-pitched whine, a sound Ethan hadn't heard since Echo's active SAR days. Echo turned, his amber eyes wide and intense, looking past Ethan toward a massive outcrop of black, basalt rock that jutted into the surging tide. He whined again, louder, and began pulling forcefully on his leash, dragging Ethan over the treacherous wet stones. This was not normal curiosity. This was a signal. Danger. Trapped subject. "Easy, boy. What is it?" Ethan struggled to keep his balance as Echo navigated the slippery rocks, pulling them around the far side of the basalt headland. As they rounded the rock face, the wind dropped, and a small, secluded inlet, a natural cove, was revealed. At low tide, this area was accessible, but as the tide was now coming in, the inlet was quickly becoming a flooded cavern. At the back of the cove, a small, dark opening marked the entrance to a cave. Looming just inside the mouth of the cave, trapped by the rising water and an unseen hazard, was a massive creature. It was a bald eagle, one of the colossal birds that dominated the skies of the Pacific Northwest. It was easily the size of a small dog, with wings spanning 7 feet, but it was contorted, struggling violently. The eagle's majestic white head and golden eyes were frantic, its powerful talons ripping uselessly at the rock. A wave receded, and Ethan saw the cause of its distress. A thick, filthy tangle of nylon fishing net, the kind commonly used for gill netting, was cinched around the eagle's left leg and one of its primary flight feathers. The net had cut deep into the flesh, which was swollen and black, clearly infected. The eagle was exhausted, weakened by hours, perhaps days, of struggle and the relentless salt water. It was too big, too strong, and too desperate to be approached without extreme caution. "Oh, hell, Echo," Ethan breathed. This wasn't salvaging wood. This was a black op against a living, panicked weapon. The rising tide meant they had less than an hour before the cave mouth was completely submerged. The decision was immediate and absolute. He couldn't leave it. Ethan quickly secured Echo's leash to a solid piece of stone outside the cove, commanding him to stay. The dog lay down, watching the cave with focused intensity. Ethan retrieved the largest piece of driftwood he could find, a thick 5-foot length of timber, to use as a distraction and shield. He lowered himself into the freezing water, moving with the slow, controlled gait of a practiced combat swimmer, keeping his body low against the frigid surf. He managed to get within 10 feet of the desperate bird, whose golden eyes, filled with fear and defiance, were fixed solely on him. Every slow step Ethan took was met with a terrifying hiss and a powerful but clumsy flap of the trapped wing. He recognized the look in those eyes, a reflection of his own warrior's pride refusing to surrender despite being cornered. He knew he couldn't free it here. He had to get it out and stabilize it. Later that afternoon, after a tense, difficult, and dangerous hour spent stabilizing the eagle, which he later dubbed Riptide, using his field dressing skills and moving it to the relative safety of the stone-walled lighthouse base, Ethan returned to the cabin searching for better securing materials. The rescue had cost him his last 3 field bandages and half a tube of medical-grade superglue. He needed heavy canvas or thick rope. Rummaging through a dusty closet filled with his father's forgotten gear, Ethan's boot kicked a rectangular object beneath a pile of moldering rain gear. It was a military surplus ammunition can, olive drab but heavily rusted. He remembered this box. His father had always kept it locked. Ethan grabbed the crowbar he'd salvaged and easily pried the rusted latch open. Inside, sealed against the elements, were 2 items: a coiled length of old maritime rope and a thick, leather-bound, marine logbook. Ethan sat down on a box, wiping the dust from the logbook's worn cover. The handwriting was unmistakable. His father, Jeremiah Cole's, jagged and strong script. He flipped to the entries leading up to the explosion 25 years ago. The entries weren't typical marine observations. They were coded and increasingly urgent. 9 août 18th. New pattern of ghost fishing evident. Heavy gauge nylon. Too much for accidental loss. Target is the deep run. 9 21st. Witness the haul. V's boys. They're using the nets meant for the big trawlers. Illegal and indiscriminate. Found 3 pups snagged near the reef. Got 2 out. Too late for the 3rd. Ethan felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He recognized the initial V. Vance. The net he'd just cut from the eagle's leg was the exact type described. His father hadn't been on a casual dive. He had been actively investigating and fighting illegal fishing operations run by Walter Vance's people. He turned to the final entry, dated the day before the explosion at the pier. 9 27th. Found the main drop point. It's the old oil drum pier. Tomorrow. Going in to cut the main line. No one else knows. Too risky to involve the department. This is my duty. This land, these waters, they're not just scenery. This is a mission, not an accident. Hope Ethan, finds a clearer path than I did. Ethan closed the book, his hand trembling. For 25 years he had lived with the belief that his father had died in a tragic work accident, a casualty of the job. But the logbook changed everything. Jeremiah Cole had died fighting an operation that Ethan now knew was tied directly to Walter Vance. His father had died on a mission, a clandestine battle to protect the coast from the same greed that now threatened his land. The weight of his own guilt, of having chosen a foreign war over the local battle his father was fighting alone, crushed him for a moment. But then the guilt hardened into a new resolve. Vance wasn't just an opportunistic buyer, he was the enemy who had indirectly caused the family tragedy. And Ethan Cole, the seasoned Navy SEAL, was now standing on the battlefield his father had fallen on. He looked toward the massive, dark form of the trapped bald eagle, riptide, safely secured in the stone tower base. The eagle was a casualty of Vance's operation, just like his father. Saving the bird was no longer just an act of kindness. It was joining the mission. He took the old maritime rope, discarded the logbook back into the can, and firmly secured the lid. The cabin was still cold, but Ethan Cole no longer felt lost. He felt focused. The urgency of Riptide's condition was paramount. The bald eagle, though contained within the dry stone shell of the lighthouse base, was burning up. Its leg, constricted by the old nylon netting, was swollen and radiating heat, a clear sign of systemic infection. The meager antibiotics Ethan had carried, a small personal reserve, were insufficient against an infection this advanced. The former SEAL, Ethan Cole, his 55-year-old face drawn tight with worry, recognized the clock was running out. He needed professional-grade supplies, wide-spectrum veterinary antibiotics, sterile surgical tools, and, crucially, heavy-duty orthopedic cutters strong enough to sever the tough, saltwater-soaked nylon and the hardened infected tissue without shattering the bird's bone. Ethan spent the next morning going through his limited possessions. His bank account was nearly depleted, reflecting years of an austere, transient life dependent on his modest military pension. The gear he owned, a collection of field knives, durable clothing, and survival rations, was invaluable to him, but worthless to a pawn shop. After hours of fruitless searching, his hand settled on the worn wooden box tucked deep under the seat of his old Ford F-250. Inside, cushioned by faded velvet, lay the Navy Commendation Medal awarded to him for actions taken during a crucial operation in the Persian Gulf 20 years prior. It was his only physical testament to a life of service, the medal heavy and cold in his palm. It was his time, his blood, his identity, and it was the only thing he had of quantifiable value. With a deep, ragged breath that steamed in the cold air, Ethan made the decision. He was trading his past for the Eagle's future. He drove the old pickup into the small coastal town of Port Haven. The drive felt different this time. He wasn't running from something, but driving for something. He pulled up in front of the Mariners Exchange, a pawn and surplus store housed in a squat brick building. Behind the counter stood Silas Novak. Novak was a man in his late 60s, white, with thick, perpetually foggy glasses perched low on a perpetually skeptical nose. He was balding, his remaining wisps of hair carefully combed over his scalp. Novak wore a thick gray cardigan over a flannel shirt, and his demeanor was quiet, detached, and pragmatic. His store was a cluttered labyrinth smelling of gun oil, aged leather, and forgotten dreams. He had seen everything come and go, from antique scrimshaw to high-powered rifles, and rarely showed surprise or mercy in his transactions. Ethan placed the medal, still in its velvet case, on the glass counter. "I need the cash equivalent for this, and access to your specialized tool cabinet." His voice was low and steady. Novak picked up the case, squinting through his thick lenses at the ribbon and the inscription. "Oh, a commendation medal," Novak grunted, setting it down and opening a large ledger. "Good piece. Collectors like the history. I can give you $300 for the medal, and we'll talk tools." Ethan felt a hollow ache in his chest, the price seeming ridiculously small for the weight of the sacrifice. But he nodded. "Deal. But I need to ensure those funds cover the specific veterinary supplies I require, including broad-spectrum antibiotics." Novak looked up, his detached eyes finally focusing on Ethan's face. "Veterinary supplies? You're not buying a new rifle, Cole. What kind of war are you fighting up there?" "One I can't walk away from," Ethan replied simply, his gaze holding steady. Novak, an old man who recognized the genuine steel in another's eyes, simply nodded, pushing the ledger aside. Let's see the tool cabinet. While Ethan was making his painful transaction in Port Haven, the situation at the isolated bluff was escalating. Walter Vance, fueled by arrogance and accustomed to immediate obedience, was infuriated by Ethan's refusal. He didn't believe the old man would actually stay, but he wouldn't risk the delay to his development schedule. He needed to apply pressure. Vance sent 2 men, heavy-set, low-level enforcers from a nearby town, up the coast to the Cole property. Dale and Mitch were easily recognizable. 2 white men in their 30s, clad in ill-fitting work clothes, faces stamped with impatience and lack of imagination. Dale was tall and thick-necked, perpetually chewing gum. Mitch was shorter, more twitchy, carrying a couple of cans of cheap spray paint and a crowbar. They were not subtle, not skilled, and certainly not prepared for the kind of discipline that still guarded the old homestead. Their instructions from Vance were crude. Make noise, make a mess, and make sure the old man knows he's unwelcome. Scare the dog if you have to. As the pair approached the perimeter near the lighthouse base, the 13-year-old German shepherd, Echo, was lying in a patch of scrub grass near the heavy canvas tarp covering the eagle's makeshift shelter. Echo's eyes, which had been resting, snapped open the moment the intruders crossed the property line. He didn't bark immediately. He simply rose, silent and immense, the white fur on his muzzle a stark contrast to the black ridge of fur that rose along his spine. The men, Dale leading, ignored the old dog. "Look at this dump," Dale scoffed, kicking at a loose piece of driftwood. Mitch immediately made for the old cabin wall, shaking the can of red spray paint. Echo didn't move toward the cabin. His mission was the shelter, the lighthouse base, where Riptide was vulnerable. As Dale moved toward the canvas tarp, intending to rip it down, Echo shifted his weight. A guttural, deep growl erupted from the dog's chest, a sound that carried the heavy, resonating warning of a wolf, not a pet. The sound was so raw and unexpected that the 2 thugs froze. "Hey, watch it, old-timer," Dale sneered, still moving toward the tarp. Echo didn't waste energy, barking. He sprang forward with a surprising burst of speed, not attacking, but interposing his massive sable and black body directly between Dale and the tarp. He lowered his head, his powerful jaws opening just enough to show the terrifying glint of his canines, his focus unwavering on the man's throat. His body was tense, rigid, a low, solid barrier. He used his weight and his size as a weapon, channeling years of specialized training into a singular, protective posture. Dale, intimidated by the sheer animalistic intensity, backed away, grabbing Mitch, who was still fiddling with the spray paint. "Forget the tarp. Let's tag the cabin and get out. The dog's nuts." They managed to spray Vance Land in garish red on a wall of the rotting cabin before the sound of the Ford F-250's engine was heard grinding its way back up the track. Ethan pulled into the clearing and killed the engine. He saw the red paint immediately, but his eyes immediately snapped to the 2 strange men running towards the boundary line. More importantly, he saw Echo, still standing rigid near the lighthouse base, his flanks heaving with exertion, but his mission accomplished. The men, attempting a quick escape, ran directly past Ethan's truck. "Hold it," Ethan's voice snapped out sharp and commanding. He didn't raise his voice, but the tone, honed over decades of command, sliced through the air. Dale and Mitch ignored him, breaking into an awkward, muddy run. Ethan moved with the sudden, controlled violence of a released spring. He was 55, but his training was muscle memory. He covered the 20 yards in 4 steps. As Dale, the larger man, passed him, Ethan didn't tackle or punch. He executed a precise, lightning-fast leg sweep and a simultaneous strike to the vagus nerve in the man's neck, a non-lethal, disabling blow. Dale collapsed, hitting the ground with a grunt, instantly disoriented. Mitch, the twitchier one, tried to turn and swing the crowbar. Ethan parried the clumsy blow with a forearm block, stepping inside the arc. He executed a quick elbow strike to the solar plexus, followed by a swift, controlled pressure on the man's radial nerve in his wrist, causing the crowbar to drop with a clang. Mitch doubled over, wheezing, the fight immediately gone. Ethan stood over the two winded, muddy figures. He didn't deliver any further blows. "Tell your employer," Ethan said, his voice cold and flat, crouching down to look directly into Dale's terrified eyes, "that this land is under new ownership. And tell him the next time you cross this line, I won't be paying attention to where you fall." He retrieved the crowbar and the spray cans, leaving the two men to struggle back into their vehicle and retreat, defeated and muddy. He walked immediately to Echo, sinking to his knees beside the dog. "Good job, buddy. Perimeter held," Ethan whispered, burying his gloved hands in the dog's thick sable and black fur. Echo licked his cheek once, a warm, rough affirmation, before resting his weary head back on the damp earth. The mission had been costly, but the loyalty had been absolute. Ethan now had the supplies and, more importantly, a renewed resolve born from the defense of his post. The wind was the first sign. It rose from a chill whisper to a relentless, low-frequency roar that vibrated through the stone foundations of the lighthouse base. The gray sky, already oppressive, began to churn a deep, angry charcoal, promising a full-scale Pacific Northwest winter tempest, the kind that brought lashing rain, biting cold, and the sudden, heavy fall of wet snow. Ethan Cole, his 55-year-old body already aching from the morning's confrontation and the previous day's rescue, recognized the urgency in the sky. The old cedar cabin was no shelter. It was a ruin. He needed to move his patient and his gear underground. The only viable refuge was the root cellar, a small subterranean structure dug deep into the hillside near the main cabin ruins, built with heavy river stones by his grandfather. It was damp, earthy, and small, but its insulation against the exterior elements was absolute. Moving Riptide was the primary challenge. The bald eagle, already weakened and feverish, was terrified. Ethan had to use the canvas tarp he'd bought along with the surgical supplies, wrapping the magnificent bird carefully, securing its powerful beak and talons while talking to it in the low, soothing rumble he'd once used to calm young, panicked recruits. Echo, sensing the necessity, remained close, his presence a calm, massive anchor that seemed to reassure the struggling eagle just enough to prevent a total panic attack. Ethan hauled the wrapped eagle, its weight significant, down the slippery slope and into the cellar. He then carried down his camping stove, meager rations, and, most importantly, the surgical tools and antibiotics bought with his medal. By the time Ethan secured the heavy wooden cellar door, the storm had arrived in full force, the wind howling like a wounded beast outside their stone sanctuary. Inside the cellar, the air was thick with damp earth and the coppery metallic scent of infection. Riptide's fever had spiked. The eagle, now resting on a thick pile of scavenged hay, was panting, its feathers slick with sweat and the wound on its leg weeping pus. The time for waiting was over. Ethan set up his makeshift operating theater under the beam of his battery-powered lantern. He sterilized the area, laid out the gleaming new orthopedic cutters, forceps, and scalpels he had purchased, placing them next to the broad-spectrum veterinary antibiotics. He worked with the focused, methodical efficiency of a field surgeon. This was familiar territory. Triage, sterile field, excision. He applied the local anesthetic, secured the bird's large body with careful ropes, and began the intricate process of cutting away the gangrenous tissue and the deeply embedded nylon net. The work was delicate, painstaking, and exhausting. Every cut was accompanied by a terrifying hiss or a sharp, instinctive jerk from Riptide. Midway through the surgery, as Ethan was cleaning the deep, infected wound with saline, the storm outside seemed to intensify its assault on the cellar walls. The wind shrieked, and a sudden, violent thunderclap shook the stones. The sound, combined with the sterile metallic smell of blood and the stifling heat generated by the kerosene lantern, was a direct, violent trigger. The cellar walls dissolved. Ethan wasn't looking at a bald eagle. He was looking through a haze of smoke and dust at a crumpled wall. He was no longer Ethan Cole, 55. He was a 30-year-old SEAL medic, crouched in the frantic chaos of the Persian Gulf Pier. The oil drum explosion, the same type of explosion that had killed his father, was a deafening echo in his mind. The scent of cordite and burning oil filled his nostrils, overwhelming the smell of earth. "Get down!" Ethan screamed, his voice raw, his eyes wide and unfocused. He saw the face of the young sailor he had failed to pull free from the collapsing pier structure. Private Miller. "It's my fault. I was too slow. I left the sector," he cried, the words torn from his throat by the sheer force of his terror and guilt. He began thrashing, trying to crawl away from the phantom collapse, convinced the stones around them were about to cave in. The shame he carried for surviving the pier collapse when his comrades did not, and for surviving the local fire that claimed his father, had coalesced into this single, paralyzing, dissociative flashback event. Echo moved instantly. The 13-year-old German shepherd, who had spent his life trained to recognize and respond to the signs of acute distress in his handler, knew exactly what was happening. Barking was useless. Violence would only increase the panic. Echo's mission changed from guard dog to service dog. With surprising agility, Echo climbed onto the floor mattress where Ethan was seizing. He was heavy, a solid 80 pounds of muscle and fur, but he moved carefully, placing his massive sable and black body directly onto Ethan's chest and stomach. This was deep pressure therapy, DPT, a technique specifically employed for severe PTSD episodes. The heavy, warm weight of the dog was an immediate, undeniable physical sensation. It countered the phantom weight of the collapsed pier and the guilt that was crushing Ethan's lungs. Echo pressed his head against Ethan's neck, whining softly, a low, vibrating sound that resonated directly through Ethan's bones. The dog began licking Ethan's face, rough, warm, and insistent. "I am here. This is real. This is now." The wet, rough sensation on his skin, the heavy, grounding weight, and the immediate smell of wet dog fur overpowered the phantoms. Ethan gasped, shuddering, his body convulsing against the solid anchor of the dog. His gray eyes slowly regained focus. He blinked, seeing the familiar amber eyes of his partner inches from his own face, filled with worried intelligence. "Echo," Ethan whispered, his voice broken. We're in the cellar." The dog didn't move until Ethan's breathing slowed to a steady, non-erratic rhythm. The warmth of the dog's body, the physical connection, was what finally pulled him through the wall of guilt and fear. Later, as Ethan, exhausted but stabilized, resumed the final stages of the surgery, his hands shaking less now, his mind clear, Echo let out a low, inquisitive woof near the cellar door. Ethan paused, listening. A faint, distressed squeaking sound was audible over the receding wind. Ethan moved to the heavy wooden door, pulling the interior bolt back just enough to peer out into the storm-whipped entrance trench. He saw nothing, but as he looked down, huddled in the small entryway where the door met the ground, was a tiny, sodden creature. It was a river otter pup, no larger than a forearm, soaked and trembling, having been swept up by the tidal surge and the storm, seeking the only source of warmth it could detect. Echo, with infinite gentleness, nudged the pup with his nose. The tiny otter, exhausted and confused, squeaked again. "Well, I'll be damned," Ethan muttered, opening the door wider and sweeping the small animal inside. The 13-year-old German shepherd ushered the otter pup toward the hay pile where Riptide lay, a natural sanctuary of warmth. The otter quickly burrowed into the hay near the eagle's foot. Ethan looked around the small, stone-walled cellar. A broken, haunted man, an old, arthritic service dog, a feverish bald eagle, and a lost river otter pup. He had come here to retreat and die slowly, but instead he had acquired a squad. The war outside was still raging, but inside the small stone refuge, Ethan Cole realized he was no longer fighting alone. The purpose, the loyalty, and the need of his new unit were the clearest path he had ever known. The storm broke just before dawn. It didn't dissipate gently. It retreated, leaving behind a profound, crystalline silence that magnified every sound. the drip of melting snow, the distant crash of the still angry ocean, and the steady, shallow breaths of the inhabitants in the root cellar. Ethan Cole woke up slowly, feeling the aches of his body but the clarity of his mind. The fever had broken. He checked Riptide immediately. The bald eagle was resting, the redness around the surgical site significantly reduced. The river otter pup, which he had temporarily named Pip, was curled against the eagle's thick feathers, drawing warmth. Echo lay at Ethan's feet, his watch done. The mission had survived the darkest night. Just as Ethan was heating water for coffee, a new sound cut through the silence, the deep, grinding thrum of a heavy-duty engine. Ethan's gaze sharpened. Walter Vance was not a man who accepted defeat silently. Minutes later, a gleaming black Lexus LX 600, followed by a dark official county sheriff's SUV, pulled onto the clearing near the ruins. Ethan stepped out of the cellar wearing his faded navy jacket, the cold morning air hitting his face like a shock. Leading the small procession was Sheriff Garrett Mills. Mills was a stout white man in his late 40s, his face rugged and honest, etched by years of dealing with the tough solitude of the rural coast. He wore a standard-issue dark uniform and a wide-brimmed sheriff's hat, his posture professional but wary. Mills was known for his fairness, but he was also acutely aware of Vance's economic power in the region. Beside Mills was Walter Vance, looking immaculate despite the snow, his shearling coat contrasting sharply with the white landscape. Standing a step behind Vance was a third man, Vance's lawyer, a nervous man in a pinstriped suit, clutching a leather briefcase. "Cole," Vance barked, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "The sheriff is here to conduct an official welfare check and property inspection. My men reported assault and illegal confinement. You're endangering yourself and, more importantly, my future investments." Sheriff Mills approached, his eyes scanning the crude, patched-up cellar entrance, the faint wisps of smoke rising from a small pipe Ethan had rigged for the camping stove, and the red spray paint still visible on the ruined cabin wall. "Mr. Cole," Mills said, his tone measured, "Mr. Vance alleges you've unlawfully detained personnel and that your living conditions are hazardous, endangering the animals and violating county ordinances. I need to conduct a search." Ethan stood aside, calm. "I welcome it, Sheriff. The property is mine, and the only violence here was initiated by his men." He gestured towards the cellar door. "Welcome to my current command post." He led them into the small, warm, root cellar. Sheriff Mills stopped abruptly inside the doorway. Vance and his lawyer pressed in behind him, stopping as soon as they grasped the scene. The small space was warm, dry, and clean, smelling faintly of earth, iodine, and animal musk. The 55-year-old white man's makeshift medical setup was visible, neat and precise. The sight was startling. The 13-year-old German shepherd, Echo, rose with a low, protective growl, standing guard. Near the back, the massive bald eagle, Riptide, rested calmly on the hay, the small river otter pup, Pip, curled trustingly between its legs. "Illegal confinement," Ethan said quietly. "These creatures chose sanctuary, Sheriff. The eagle was hours from death, trapped in the illegal nylon net your friend's operations use." Sheriff Mills looked at the healing bird, then at the tools. He saw the discipline of the scene, not the squalor Vance had promised. "Mr. Cole, about that net," Mills began. Ethan reached into a salvaged wooden chest and pulled out the old, leather-bound marine logbook. "This is my father's journal, Sheriff, dated 25 years ago. He was a diver. He was fighting Vance's ghost fishing long before his accident. Note the dates, the description of the illegal netting, and the identification of the primary operator." Ethan handed the book to the sheriff. Mills took the book, his expression serious. As he read the entry details, his eyes hardened. The journal wasn't just a sentimental relic. It was crucial evidence of decades of ecological crime directly linked to Vance's coastal operations. Vance's face, which had been smug, turned a sickly shade of white. "Sheriff," Vance sputtered, trying to maintain control. "That's hearsay. Old meaningless scribbling." Mills looked up from the book, fixing Vance with a steady, ethical gaze. This, coupled with the fact that the injured eagle is indeed wrapped in that exact type of nylon, provides more than probable cause for an environmental investigation, Mr. Vance. As for the welfare check, Mr. Cole and his animals are secure, warm, and receiving professional care. Mills handed the logbook back to Ethan. "I suggest you and your counsel contact the Department of Fish and Wildlife immediately. And, Mr. Cole," he paused, giving Ethan a respectful nod, "I recommend you get a no trespassing sign that is more permanently affixed." Vance, defeated, stormed out, his lawyer trailing behind him, frantically trying to salvage the situation. Ethan had won the battle for the land and, more importantly, won his father's final fight. The next few weeks became a dedicated mission. Riptide, with Ethan's meticulous care, the result of his SEAL medic training applied to avian anatomy, recovered quickly. The river otter, Pip, eventually found its way back to the creek, but not before providing the small team with moments of curious levity. Riptide's flight day was a moment of profound significance. Ethan, standing on the coastal bluff with Echo, watched the great bird unfurl its heeled wings. With a powerful beat, the eagle soared into the clear sky, circling the ancient stone lighthouse once, a final salute before disappearing inland. Ethan had kept his word to his father and to the land. Ethan officially registered the property, not as a private residence, but as the Jeremiah Cole Marine Rescue Lighthouse, a small private center dedicated to the rehabilitation of injured coastal wildlife. He wasn't selling. His skills, discipline, resourcefulness, medical precision, and loyalty had finally found their true healing purpose. One afternoon, a small padded package arrived by certified mail. Ethan opened it slowly. Inside, resting on a bed of fresh velvet, was his Navy Commendation Medal. Tucked beneath it was a small, handwritten note on a business card from a military surplus store miles up the coast. The note simply read, "The price of loyalty is not a few $100s. It's paid in duty. Welcome home. Jay." It was from an old SEAL buddy who had recognized the medal, inquired about the sale, and redeemed it, paying the price of the medal and nothing more. Ethan held the medal, feeling the weight of honor returned. He was no longer trading his past. He was integrating it. Standing on the bluff, his navy jacket pulled tight against the breeze, Ethan looked down at Echo, who leaned heavily against his leg, and saw the strong stone base of the old lighthouse. They were a family: the broken warrior, the aging sentinel, and the restored sanctuary. Ethan had finally come home, not to the ashes and guilt of the past, but to a purpose that brought peace. He forgave himself for leaving, realizing that his father's mission, like his own, was never about the location, but about holding the line. Sometimes the miracle we seek isn't found in a grand external intervention, but in the unwavering loyalty and purpose God places right beside us, be it in the steadfast eyes of an old dog or the desperate need of a creature trapped in the darkness. Ethan believed he had failed, but his greatest redemption came when he stopped running and used his unique gifts to become a sanctuary for the forgotten. He transformed his guilt into a lighthouse, shining a beacon of hope where only ruins stood. This story reminds us that in our daily lives, our brokenness is not a flaw, but an invitation to find a new mission. No life is ever too far gone for redemption and purpose. Look around you. Perhaps the creature, the mission, or the person who needs saving is the very one who will save you. If Riptide and Echo's story strengthened your faith in the power of loyalty and second chances, share this message of hope with a loved one who feels lost. Comment below and share a moment when purpose healed you, and subscribe to the channel to join our growing family of hope. May God bless you and keep you, guiding your steps in the silence and the storm.